Walter Rothschild was a weird guy. A super weird guy. Weird enough that his eccentricities somehow led him over the course of his life to amass a private collection of almost 3 million zoological specimens. We're going to talk about how, and about the truly extraordinary way that he lost almost all of it. Lionel Walter Rothschild was born in 1868, heir to the most powerful private banking dynasty in recorded history, generational wealth, a 600-acre estate, and he basically had every institutional advantage available to a Victorian man, and he had more than any man ever has had in the previous history. The best part is that he used none of it for banking. Instead, through obsession, determination, and tolerance for dangerous animals on his property that I can only describe as strategically ill-advised, he built the largest private natural history collection the world has ever seen. And then he lost almost all of it, in a way that is, and I want to be precise here, one of the most extraordinary personal finance collapses in Victorian history. Right then, let's get into it. To properly audit the disaster we're about to examine, we need to establish the baseline resource position. The Rothschild family by the mid-19th century had achieved a degree of financial dominance over the European continent that I can only describe as administratively unprecedented. They financed wars, they stabilized currencies, they lent to sovereign governments with the casual precision of a very well-dressed utility. Into this environment of total institutional competence, Walter arrived in 1868, and after he arrived, he proceeded to spend his entire inheritance on birds. Now, to be fair, the early environmental factors for Walter were suboptimal at best. His mother, Emma, kept him in near total social isolation as a child. No peer interaction, no social skill development, no exposure to the kind of human navigation that running a dynasty would eventually require. From a character development standpoint, this was a slight oversight with somewhat cascading long-term consequences. And at age 7, his governess was walking him through the village that was on the 600-acre estate that they lived on there, and they passed by the workshop of a man named Alfred Meynell, a local carpenter who practiced taxidermy as a little side hustle. Walter watched Meynell skin a mouse, preserve it, and transform the dead creature into a permanent specimen of scientific record. And that, allegedly, was the moment. That afternoon at tea time, a 7-year-old Walter Rothschild stood up and said to his parents, "Mama, Papa, I'm going to make a museum, and Mr. Meynell is going to help me look after it." His parents called it a phase. Now just imagine, you're looking at the heir to the most powerful banking family in Europe, and your assessment of this child is, it's a phase. Administratively speaking, this was the first in a very long sequence of strategically ill-advised evaluations on account of his parents. By age 10, Walter was running a functioning museum from a garden shed with a professional staff. By 14, the collection had expanded considerably, and on his 21st birthday, his father, Natty, apparently attempted to contain the damage by giving it permanent walls, gifting Walter a purpose-built museum building on the Tring estate. Administratively speaking, this is the institutional equivalent of trying to fix a flooding basement by installing a better bathtub. The museum would eventually contain 300,000 bird skins alone. Natty's bathtub was somewhat larger than anticipated. And now look, I know what you're thinking. Eccentric rich guy, usual hobby, we get it. I would have thought the same thing if I had not read the rest of the audit. We have not gotten to Cambridge yet, where he went to school, or to the bears delivered to the front of the steps of the bank that he had worked at, that was his father's, the Rothschild Bank, or the wolf, or the 40 years of unopened correspondence in padlocked baskets, or why exactly he went completely broke. Everything is connected, and we're going to answer all those questions. Just stay with me. But before we go a lot further, I want to let you know that most of the information that you're getting today came from this book, and I do as much primary source research as humanly possible for every one of these episodes on this channel, and that means buying books, actual physical books, which regrettably cost a lot of money. One quick side note, that book, The Feather Thief, it's about a guy who in 2009 stole over $1 million worth of bird feathers from what museum other than the one that Rothschild actually started. And I'm going to be making a video about that in the very near future. So if you want to hear about that, you can subscribe now. Thank you. Now, if you want to help me keep reading and doing that and buying books and keep making these episodes, there is a link in the video description and in the pinned comment below to my Buy Me a Coffee page. Enough of that, let's get back to Rothschild. In 1887, his daddy, Natty Rothschild, enrolled Walter in the Magdalene College at Cambridge. The theory was that Cambridge would socialize Walter, sharpen his soft skills, and produce a functioning future head of N.M. Rothschild and Sons. Walter arrived at Cambridge with a flock of Kiwis. Literally, a living flock of kiwi birds trailing behind a 6'3", 300-pound man with a severe stutter and a documented presence for avian company over human company. And look, I have covered a lot of eccentric historical behaviors in my line of work, but arriving at one of the most prestigious universities in the world with a personal flock of Kiwis is, and I want to be very clear here, absolute madness. This is not a quirk. This is a statement of intent. He described the Kiwis, incidentally, as diffident, which is the exact same word his contemporaries used to describe Walter. Historians have not noted this enough. The university eventually ordered the birds back to Tring. Walter left 2 years later without a degree, having found the coursework what he called tedious. In Walter Rothschild's vocabulary, tedious means not birds. So just let me know real quick before we get into any more details. Do you think Walter Rothschild is a misunderstood genius born into the wrong family, or just a man with unlimited resources who refuses to do literally anything that he was asked? I want to know where you're at this point in the video, so just let me know in the comments. From 1889 to 1908, Walter was stationed at N.M. Rothschild and Sons in Newcourt, London. This was, for all parties involved, a slight oversight. Walter possessed no measurable aptitude for finance. While colleagues managed international bond issues and sovereign debt consultations, Walter was mentally at the museum in Tring, where new specimens arrived daily. At the bank, he was described as miserable, but at the museum, he would bubble with enthusiasm the moment a new box of beetles materialized. The incident that most vividly illustrated the mismatch in this professional arrangement occurred when 2 live bear cubs were delivered to the front steps of the bank. Intended for Walter's collection at the museum, but addressed to the bank. So you're running the most prestigious private bank in Europe. Your client list includes heads of state, and your eldest son is having live bears sent to the front door. Just imagine it. This is a fiduciary nightmare that is genuinely, actually, a fiduciary nightmare. His father's response was not recorded in a vocabulary that's suitable for this channel's content, unfortunately. Now, before we get into the real juicy details of, the more insane animals and the more insane stuff that goes on, I want to address the psychological mechanism at work here, because this is not merely a story about an eccentric man with too much money. This is a textbook case of what developmental psychologists call avoidant identity formation. The mechanism is when an individual is structurally unable to basically inhibit the identity their environment has assigned. They don't simply just give up. They construct a parallel identity domain in which genuine mastery is achievable. It's basically like a compensatory universe, its own hierarchy, its own rules, its own metrics of success. Walter failed every skill check the Rothschild institutional framework required. Things like financial instinct, social navigation, diplomatic fluency, he failed repeatedly. And instead of grinding those skills, he built a different game entirely. The museum was not a hobby, it was a compensatory universe, a domain where Walter's classification system was law, his expertise was unquestioned, and nobody was sending memos about the current yield of Prussian government bonds. There is a second layer worth noting. Walter was once dragged off his horse and physically assaulted by a workman near Tring, an attack he attributed personally to anti-Semitism. So a member of the most powerful Jewish family in Europe was still subject to its most brutal street-level expressions. This deepened his withdrawal from the human world considerably. See, animals made sense to Walter. They could be cataloged, measured, and preserved. They did not assault you on horseback just because you were Jewish. People, from an organizational standpoint, were a significantly worse investment to Walter. And look, the animals at least had the decency to cause only physical damage. The people in Walter's life were about to cost him considerably more. In 1892, the Walter Rothschild Zoological Museum opened to the public on Aikman Street in Tring. And I want to establish exactly what this institution was because private museum undersells it considerably. This was a world-class research facility, 30,000 visitors annually, glass cases containing polar bears, rhinoceroses, a full elephant mount, etc. Taxidermied sharks, suspended from the ceiling. It was, by all objective standards, a genuinely extraordinary scientific institution that happened to be funded entirely by one man who was supposed to be running a bank. Now, I know what you're saying. You're saying, how the hell did he get all this stuff? Well, Walter had deployed nearly 400 collectors across every continent. The map of their locations was described by one contemporary as the world with a severe attack of measles. Collectors operated under Walter's direct written instructions, preservation protocols, feeding regimens for live specimens in transit, subspecies prioritization by region, etc., etc. One collector by the name of C.M. Harris was stationed in San Francisco for several months to personally supervise live Galapagos tortoises who had been discovered to prefer a diet of bananas and squash. One of Walter's collectors, in a darker turn, had his arm bitten off by a leopard. Now, obviously, Walter recorded this in his correspondence with that man who was now writing to him with his other hand, and he continued the expedition. He didn't care. He didn't cancel it or do anything. So just so we're clear here, a man lost his arm to a leopard while being employed by Walter Rothschild, and he continued the expedition. This is not a compliant risk management framework by any standard currently recognized by a professional body, obviously. So here is where we are at the midpoint of the audit. He's got approximately 2.25 million Lepidoptera, that's butterflies the last time I checked, 300,000 bird skins, 200,000 eggs, 2,000 mounted mammals, and a collection of somewhere north of like 30,000 different books. All of it was personally funded, and all of it was personally managed. And simultaneously, a day job he is catastrophically unsuited for, a living estate that is one escaped large reptile away from a formal neighbor complaint, and, if you've been paying attention to the framing of this episode, some variety of financial catastrophe will have to be arriving soon, right? Tring Park was not a house with animals in it. It was a liability with a house attached. Stuff like kangaroos in the paddocks, emus in the garden, a zebroid whose behavioral profile I can only describe as existentially unresolved. By the way, a zebroid is like a zebra-horse hybrid mixture. Walter was once photographed riding a 150-year-old Galapagos tortoise named Rotuma. The motivational strategy for the tortoise was a dangled lettuce leaf in front of his face. Walter, a 6'3", 300-pound man, perched atop the tortoise like a monument for the most patient commute in Victorian history. And there was a wolf, a quote-unquote tame wolf, which Walter took to the village pub on a collar and chain, where it started altercations with local dogs regularly. His father had already attempted to ban all live acquisitions after a cassowary delivered what historical record describes as dangerous slicing sideways kicks to Natty's horse. Walter's response was to continue acquiring the birds in secret, routing shipments through off-site locations until he could smuggle them onto the grounds when his father wasn't looking. By the way, cassowaries, that's one of the most dangerous and insane birds that they make, and they can fully kill you like super easily. That's part of why I put it on the thumbnail for this video. So to summarize, this is a clandestine cassowary smuggling operation on his own family's estate past his own father. That is not the behavior of someone unaware of consequences. That is someone who has weighed the diplomatic cost against the cassowary and concluded that the cassowary was worth the risk. Now, I don't agree with the decision, but I do respect the conviction. And I want to know, do you feel the same way? Let me know in the comments. In the 1890s, the scientific consensus held that zebras were fundamentally untamable, too prone to panic, and constitutionally unsuited for draft work or pulling any kind of wagons or anything like that, and so they were not obviously a viable alternative to horses. Now, obviously, Walter, owning like 75 zebras, disagreed with this, and he said zebras were great. So, naturally, over several years, he systematically conditioned a team of zebras at Tring Park, and in 1898, he drove a carriage pulled by 4 zebras to Buckingham Palace. Now, some accounts say that it was 6, and some say it was 4, so I'm just going to say it was 4, but you can read into that. It kind of varies, but ultimately it was between 4 and 6 zebras. And then he took the zebras to the Royal Albert Hall. And he did this just as basically a publicly conducted scientific experiment. He essentially ran it as a controlled experiment with a testable hypothesis and a documented conclusion. The hypothesis: zebras can be conditioned to perform carriage work. The conclusion: confirmed, with qualifications that they remain prone to panic, lack the endurance of horses, and are unsuitable for widespread adoption. But he did do it. However, the most revealing moment of the entire expedition was not the zebras. It was when Princess Alexandra walked over to pet one of the zebras. Walter, who had trained zebras, ridden a tortoise, taken a wolf to a pub, smuggled cassowaries past his own father, and had live bears addressed to his bank, watched in what witnesses would describe as pure terror. Not because of the zebras, because of the social implications of a member of the royal family touching one of his zebras. This man built an entire parallel universe to escape situations exactly like this one, and his zebra carriage drove him directly into an awkward social situation he didn't want. So just really quickly, if this descent into Victorian institutional catastrophe is proving useful to you, subscribing costs you $0 and it tells the algorithm that I'm a legitimate educational resource. You can also drop a comment if you want to help. I read all of those, obviously. Now we get to the juicy stuff, the blackmail. So Walter Rothschild, despite his social paralysis and his clear preference for the company of non-humans, had a personal life, unbelievably. His personal life was structured with no regard for risk management whatsoever. You'll see what I mean in a second. He maintained simultaneous affairs with 2 different women. That's Lizzie Ritchie and Marie Fredrinson. She was an aspiring actress. Both installed in separate London apartments following their introductions at a party hosted by the future King Edward VII. However, when Lizzie discovered Marie's existence, the situation escalated rapidly. Walter's brother, Charles, was actually deployed as what the historical record calls a fixer. And obviously, Charles being the fixer that he was, he resolved the crisis pretty much immediately with a ton of cash and by giving the women a bunch of free land. That's a bit of an expensive corrective action for a preventable structural failure, wouldn't you say? But the more consequential arrangement involved a third party, an anonymous woman and her husband. Oh, what's going on here? This couple, described by Walter's niece Miriam, who eventually cracked the case, she described them as charming, witty, aristocratic, and ruthless. They blackmailed Walter for 40 consecutive years. 40 years. They targeted with surgical precision his two primary vulnerabilities: his terror of his mother discovering his personal, raunchy, nasty, swinging life, and his desperate need to protect the Rothschild family name. Every demand was met, every payment made. Walter funded this arrangement through the only mechanism available, continuing to operate a world-class museum on resources he did not fully possess. 40 years. At any point in those 40 years, eventually, your philanderings will catch up with you. And that's not a possibility. That is a certainty. Walter Rothschild knew that. He just kept putting the correspondence in a basket. We will get to the basket. The Wicker basket system is not poor organization. It's a system justification theory in three-dimensional physical form. So system justification theory is something that was developed by psychologists John Jost and Mazarin Banaji, describes the human tendency to actively defend and perpetuate existing arrangements, even when those arrangements are demonstrably and measurably harmful to the individual. The critical insight is that the logic of the system justification is not this arrangement is working. It is acknowledging that this arrangement is broken requires me to confront everything that caused me to be in this situation in the first place. So Walter's system, the blackmailers demand what they want, Walter pays, the letter goes into the basket gets padlocked, the museum continues, life proceeds with a functioning internal peace while financial ruin basically ferments in the corner in the basket. The alternative, or the fix for this problem, would have been opening the basket, confronting the correspondence, disclosing the situation to his family, and that was obviously more than unpleasant. It was, in Walter's psychological framework, an existential catastrophe. It meant his mother finding out. It meant the family examining his private life. It meant everything he had built coming under institutional review. So he ran the broken system for 4 decades with the same meticulous precision he applied to cassowary taxonomy. And look, I want to be, pretty clear here. All these people are completely insane, both sides of this transaction. The blackmailers for thinking that this was a viable 40-year revenue stream, although it ended up working, and Walter for paying it for 40 years without once opening the basket or his mouth to anyone else. So in the end, his niece Miriam pried the baskets open after he had died, and inside, 40 years of financial collapse and the identity of everyone involved. It is, regrettably, not really a surprise ending, I guess. By 1931, the compound damage of all this stuff had become mathematically irreconcilable. 4 decades of blackmail payments combined with the chronic overspending required to maintain the world's largest private scientific institution on personally managed funds had rendered Walter Rothschild effectively insolvent. His father had disinherited him in 1915, passing the baronetcy to Walter and the family estate to his brother, Charles the Fixer, who, obviously fixed up his multi-lady situation previously. Walter kept the museum. He lost the financial infrastructure that had quietly sustained it, obviously, since his father had disowned him. So with no remaining asset of sufficient liquidation value, Walter made the decision that those who witnessed it described consistently as devastating. He sold 280,000 bird skins to the American Museum of National History in New York for somewhere in the neighborhood of $225,000 to $250,000. The sum assessed by every contemporary evaluation as far below market value. The skins from 4 continents, the work of 400 collectors across several decades, the cost of at least one man's arm. Crafted, crated, and shipped to Manhattan. He kept 65 cassowary specimens, which were the remnants of his first and most enduring obsession. And he essentially shrank afterwards. I don't know that he lost any weight. I'm pretty sure he was still really big and really fat. But witnesses recorded it. He spent only a few hours a day in the museum. The building that had been his entire world was now a monument to what had been inside it previously. One final entry, though, really quickly. In 1917, Walter Rothschild disinherited, actively blackmailed, professionally irrelevant to the bank for which he had never had any aptitude, received a letter addressed to Dear Lord Rothschild. It was the Balfour Declaration, one of the most consequential diplomatic documents of the 20th century, addressed to Walter as the titular head of the British Jewish community, delivered to the man with a padlocked wicker basket on the same desk. Regrettably, history did not coordinate the timing more thoughtfully. Walter Rothschild died in 1937. In a final act that was considerably more generous than his financial management would suggest was possible, he bequeathed his museum and all remaining collections to the nation. 2 million insects, 30,000 books, every taxidermy specimen that had not been shipped to New York. His tombstone at Williston Jewish Cemetery carries a verse from the book of Job, and it says, "Ask of the beasts, and they will tell thee, and the birds of the air shall declare unto thee." The Natural History Museum at Tring stands today and as a genuinely important research institution. Not a monument to a failed baron, a monument to a man who spent his entire life playing the wrong game and still built something world-class in the one game that suited him. So what does Walter Rothschild's audit tell us? It tells us that the gap between assigned identity and actual identity does not produce compromise when it gets large enough. It produces a museum or a padlocked basket, or in this particular case, both simultaneously, in the same building on the same estate. It tells us that secrets maintained through system justification do not stay contained indefinitely. They get opened eventually, usually by your niece, usually after you are dead, at which point, regrettably, corrective options available to you are extremely limited. The cassowaries are still at Tring, interestingly enough, and obviously they still have the same sideways kick that could decapitate a grown man. If this examination of Victoria-era resource misallocation, padlocked administrative avoidance, and the single most expensive personal filing system in recorded history have been of value to you, there is another episode on this channel, and it covers a historical event that is, if anything, more strategically indefensible than this one. The link is on the screen. The algorithm placed it there, and I'm told it is relevant. We document the disasters, you watch them. It is mutually beneficial, essentially, in my opinion. So all you have to do is subscribe and stay, as always, clinically detached.